Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to Newcastle University. I'm sorry about the rain today. We had glorious sunshine yesterday. I hope some of you got here yesterday and saw some of that, and hopefully that will return tomorrow. I'm really thrilled to see so many familiar faces here from our field of Xinjiang studies, but also excited to know so many new faces from beyond it. This conference has been a very long time in the making, as many of you know. It was postponed twice in a year as we bowed to the ravages of COVID. And then in March, I became the target of a PRC political sanction designed to intimidate me from continuing my scholarship on the Uyghurs. This meeting couldn't have taken place now without the staunch support of a wide range of organizations and individuals, both within and without the university. Good morning, Alp. At Newcastle, we have received financial, organisational and moral support at university, faculty and school levels. And here I particularly thank our Pro-Vice-Chancellor in the Faculty of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Nigel Harkness. Also our conference support teams and research support teams. Externally, we have received funding from the Jiang Jingguo Foundation and the China and Inner Asia Council of the Association for Asian Studies, and the sponsorship of multiple organisations working for the defence of human rights. Many of the representatives of those organisations are here today. For myself, I've been lucky to be surrounded by a spectacular team of bright and spirited colleagues and postgraduates with a conscience. My co-organisers and towers of strength, Hannah Burdorf and Professor Nick McGorran. Our impressive production team, Henry and Carrie Poon. And our wonderful PhD student helpers, Izzy Miller, Emily Upson, Nick Sundin and Tom Lien Ho. So what did we aim to do when we designed this conference? We hope to bring together disparate groups that are all working hard to evidence and ultimately to prevent harm to the Turkic peoples in Xinjiang, northwest China. They include scholars, journalists, lawyers, human rights, NGOs, politicians, think tank analysts and concerned citizens. Here in the UK, we take our freedoms for granted. We have little sense of what it's like to be a Uyghur in Xinjiang, or indeed another person living under an authoritarian state. Inside a Xinjiang internment camp or prison, a person is locked up for who they are, on the basis of their ethnicity, and not for what they do. Outside of the camps, they face linguistic, cultural, religious, and now demographic castration. During my last trip to the field in 2018, I witnessed firsthand the rising levels of fear and intimidation produced by Chinese state terror among Uyghur communities. In 2016, the alarm bells rang when a friend drove me all the way out of Urumqi city into the mountains and then abandoned their car before finally feeling able to speak frankly halfway up a mountain path. By 2018, not even this was possible, and most Uyghur friends devised ever more desperate excuses to avoid seeing me. The two who did meet with me did so only under cover of darkness, and they insisted on walking around so as not to be continuously observed in my company. When our colleague Hannah arrived in Xinjiang in 2019, she found a police state gone into hiding, with many of the trappings of securitization now concealed, and yet a people kept in a state of permanent fear, like a wife cowed by the threat of domestic violence. She found almost complete silence. All possibility of opposition evaporated. By this point, the CCP has successfully made it appear as though nothing is happening in Xinjiang. An original starting point for this conference, when we began to conceive it 18 months ago, was what do we call this? One of the earliest scholars to speak of abuses in Xinjiang as genocide was Cornell's Magnus Fiskesjö. Yet because at that stage we were speaking largely of cultural destruction, the term was not immediately picked up. This changed in June 2020, when new and shocking information around birth prevention since 2016 forced the word genocide into popular parlance. Originally, our meeting had aimed to debate whether or not the Xinjiang abuses were genocide. But as the conference was repeatedly postponed, this debate began to rage in the media and on social media, with often disjunctive inputs from academic, legal and political perspectives. We might observe now that perhaps 2 or perhaps 3 firm camps have emerged. One school of thought supporting a genocide designation, and also supported by concerned politicians in 7 countries to date. A second that embraces a narrow legal interpretation that views only mass killings to be deserving of the term. And a third that takes a blithely denialist position and claims there's nothing to see. Despite this disagreement, what most people are now united in believing is that we are witnessing crimes against humanity. A second united position emerging is that this is no longer the time to debate labels, but rather the time to take concerted action. How do we make this harm stop? Over the next 3 days, we will bring together the brightest minds from academia, law, civil society, and politics that they might share information, lend expertise, and strategize about the most effective ways to achieve justice, bring an early end to the abuses, and obtain reparations to Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other victims of the CCP campaign of re-education. The political sanctions placed on me and on other academics in late March 2021 was the result, in part, of our publishing research that highlighted potentially genocidal acts taking place in Xinjiang. They and the sanctions levied on parliamentarians, legal chambers, and even the Uyghur tribunal chaired by the UK's top judge are an open attempt to intimidate and silence beyond China's borders. In this context, we cannot but ask ourselves, what is the CCP trying to hide? I look forward to many valuable exchanges over the next 3 days. And now I would like to invite Peter Hopkins, Professor of Social Geography and our former Dean of Social Justice, to say a few words to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. So I have a slightly different accent from Joe, because I'm from Glasgow in Scotland, so despite what some of you may be looking at, I'm actually speaking English, just to clarify. So I normally say that at the start so you can tune into my accent. So just to say, I'm not a specialist at all on this topic. And sometimes it can be quite useful having somebody from outside a disciplinary area of expertise make some observations. But for me, really, a lot of what Joe's just said and a lot of what I see this topic is about social justice. And social justice is about the distribution of society's benefits and burdens. And it's about addressing the unfair outcomes that result from the coming together of social inequalities and institutions. Now, I see real potential in this conference because of the way that I see that it foregrounds social justice for a social group that's been heavily stigmatised and excluded as a result of exploitative state-sponsored institutional power and decision-making. The second thing is that to work towards social justice, I think we need to appreciate the operation of issues relating to discrimination and marginalisation. So there's something really important here about placing a spotlight on those issues so that we can understand how those operate and then we can work to overcome them. And so in already what Joe said, I can see that there's a real potential in this conference for foregrounding those issues to see how they're operating and therefore how they can then be overcome. And my third and final point would be about universities providing an ideal forum to address issues of social justice. If we fully utilise our capacity as academics, as researchers, as activists, I think we can embrace scholar activism and we can really use that as a way to change the world for the better. And in this case, we've got a lot of specific examples here. On the 13th of November 1967, Newcastle University, where we're currently sitting, gave Dr. Martin Luther King an honorary degree. And it's the only UK university to do so during his lifetime. And during his speech, he said, and this is a quote, "There are 3 urgent and indeed great problems that we face. That is the problem of racism, the problem of poverty, and the problem of war. And the things that I've been trying to do in our struggle at home and in the struggle that is taking place all over the world has been to deal forthrightly and in depth with these great and grave problems that pervade our world." And you can see his full speech online if you wanted to look it up. So I can see that many of the contributors to the programme of this conference are motivated by these problems. They want to explore these social inequalities and social injustices to see how they can be challenged and overcome. And so I see this conference as providing a really fruitful opportunity to think through these different struggles, how they can be overcome, and what we as scholars and activists can do to contribute to this. So I look forward to watching online and in person and hearing all your different insights. And I'd also just like to say it's quite something organising a conference like this. I think it's amazing that Joe's managed to do this, not just in the political circumstances, but also, you know, there's so much work involved in something like this. So many congratulations for putting all this together. Thank you. And Hannah and everyone else, well done. Thank you.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor James Millward from Georgetown University, who will bring us some context and historical background to the current crisis. History of the crisis in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, Trends in Development and Assimilation. Camera? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, sorry for the tech hitch. There will be a few tech hitches over the next 3 days. This will not be the last one, I'm sure. Okay, so once again, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor James Millward from Georgetown University. His paper is History of the Crisis in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, Trends in Development and Assimilation. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, hello, good morning. Can you all hear me? Joe, stand there. Come back, actually. No. Anyway, so I can see you in this camera on the laptop to your right in front of you now. Right in front of you now. All right. Anyway, you can see me and hear me. All right. I'm sorry about this. I am being identified as Professor Peter Hopkins, it seems, but I'm not. I'm Jim Millward, and as I guess you can all see in the chat, we're not hearing the room very well. Just the odd syllable coming through. But I'm assuming you can hear me. So I'm just going to soldier on. And again, thank Joe very much for setting up this really important meeting. And I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person. I'm going to deviate a little bit from my abstract. And the title of what I'm talking about today should be how we should talk about the history of the Uyghur region. And the PRC. So I'll get to the history, but in a slightly different way. As many of you know, a year ago, I finished a new chapter for my book, Eurasian Crossroads, updating the edition. And it's out in the British version. The US version is coming out soon. If any of you looked at it, you'll note there's a real change of tone in the last chapter. I've entitled the last chapter, Colonialism, Assimilationism, and Ethnocide from the 2000s through the 2020s. And of course, the reasons for that change are obvious. But it's not a case of me sort of changing the history because of current events. History is the study of the past by people in the present, and the present atrocities being inflicted on peoples in the Uyghur region make it urgently necessary to think about that past and to rethink it in cogent and relevant new ways. And that's what I was driven to do by that process. So I wrote a new chapter updating it. I didn't rewrite all the earlier chapters that deal with the region since the Bronze Age, and I wasn't able, unfortunately, to integrate all of the new research that's emerged since the early 2000s. But I did think in that process of rereading and looking over the book again, beyond the history of Altashar and Jungaria, more broadly, how we can talk about China and Chinese history and its relations to Central Asia. So flipping through textbooks, reconsidering my own writings, and reading and recalling some of the more popular introductions to China, I found that we often talk about Chinese history with some deeply embedded concepts and terminology that echo and even support the disingenuous, nationalistic, and whitewashing PRC state narrative. So today I want to highlight some of the things that I've been thinking about and suggest some needed changes in how we think and talk about the history of Sinic and non-Sinic states and peoples in what is now the PRC. In particular, focusing on terminology that we use habitually, often without sufficient consideration of its meaning and implication. These terms are vitally important for anyone recording and communicating about the crisis in Xinjiang now, or similar crisis facing Tibet, Mongolia, Hong Kong, Taiwan. It's important for academics, of course, to think about our language as we're the teachers of students and teachers of journalists, and often when we talk with journalists. But it's also important for writers, for the media, for jurists, for researchers writing reports, for think tanks and government agencies, to think about the terminology that we use and the concepts that we employ. So how should we talk about the history of the Uyghur region, or East Turkestan, or Xinjiang? How can we decolonize the historiography of China? So my first concept here is this issue of Xinjiang belongs to China, a phrase that we've often heard. One common reaction to criticism about PRC policies in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or elsewhere in the so-called frontiers of the PRC is this. If someone says, stop oppressing the Uyghurs, the response is often something like, Xinjiang belongs to China. There's short Twitter versions of this argument. There are comments often angrily shouted from the audience at a talk, or scrawled in the chat and Zoom seminars. But also, again and again, the PRC has itself issued white papers about Xinjiang or about Tibet that begin essentially the same way, with a highly tendentious history lesson. For Xinjiang, of course, we hear first about the Han Dynasty. Now, really, this is a non sequitur, since mostly the criticism has nothing to do with sovereignty at all. And actually, I call this the wife beater defense. So if someone says, stop beating your wife, and the response is, she's my wife and I'll beat her if I want to, that's the kind of logic that is really playing out here in this argument about historical primacy or ownership, so-called ownership. The PRC's repeated vehement recourse to supposed historical primacy of China in now what is Xinjiang is really very revealing. It reveals deep anxiety about the occupation of Xinjiang in the first place. And any reading of late 19th, early 20th century Han nationalist discussions shows that there was no general sense of primordial Chineseness of Xinjiang. That Qing Central Asia should be part of a Chinese nation state was not a view unanimously held by those theorizing about what the Chinese nation and post-monarchical Chinese state would look like. Instead, arguments were constructed, just as they were constructed to argue that the Qing Empire, mortal enemy of Sun Yat-sen and other nationalists, was itself an avatar of something only in the late 19th century, beginning to be officially called China. And in fact, the first use of Zhongguo, of China, in a treaty signed by the Qing, as opposed to Qing Empire or Daqing Diguo, the first use was in the Treaty of Levadia, which was signed in 1879 with Russia to restore Qing control over northern Xinjiang or over Jungaria. The process of making Xinjiang part of this new polity called China was clearly a colonial endeavor involving construction of arguments, framing of narratives, and eventually extension of power. Early Chinese nationalists and Xinjiang governor warlord Yang Zengxin recognized this to be a colonial process. And they, in fact, openly studied and talked about European and American models. And I'll mention this a little bit at the very end of my talk. So this is the backdrop backdrop to the PRC's Minzu system and territorial autonomy system that gave us the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The Minzu system and this territorial autonomy system are clearly, like the Soviet equivalent, efforts to deal with the optics of that post-imperial condition in ways that are politically acceptable for socialist internationalists that the early CCP was. At least in part, they're to deal with the optics. And the other part, I'm sorry, the early CCP were in part socialist internationalists, but in the other part, they were stalwart Han nationalists. To a certain extent, the Minzu system and the territorial autonomy system were also a sporadically observed attempt to actually deal with the reality of colonialism, of chauvinism and racism, and the fact that the CCP was a predominantly Han nationalist party, now ruling over huge non-Han territories. But to return to this sort of wife-beater historical defense, besides being a non sequitur, the historical primacy argument relies on a highly exceptionalist approach to history. The set of concepts and terms we use for talking about Chinese history are unique to that realm and really quite different from how we talk about otherwise similar phenomena in Europe, say, or in the Islamic world, in the Islamicate. Now, I only have time to briefly touch on some of the big conceptual issues that are integral to this grand narrative of Chinese history. And after that, I'll look specifically at some terms. Okay, so conceptual issues related to this grand narrative. The first set I'm going to just mention in passing are the ideas of the tributary system, Tianxia, all under heaven, Sinicization, and the Confucian peace. Now, I won't dwell on these because all of them have been roundly and publicly critiqued by historians really already since the 1990s, and particularly in the field of Qing history. The specialist historians don't use them as much as we used to, but unfortunately, they're still not eradicated from popular sources, including the textbooks that we use to teach our students. And they actually turn out to be very useful now for Xi Jinping's visions of Chinese exceptionalism. The idea of Tianxia, or even the tributary system, kind of implicitly dovetails, in particular, with the rhetoric of the Belt and Road Initiative. And with constantly reiterated arguments that China is peaceful and has never invaded anywhere. I won't say more of these, but there's a really a much bigger and much more exclusive, Someone in the audience has been texting me and telling me things. It wasn't them just then, but that's why I was checking, excuse me. So there's a bigger and even more exclusive one of these conceptual keywords that's not really been questioned yet. And that's the concept of Chinese dynasty in and of itself, or of dynasty. Now, other places have monarchies, they have empires, they have polities. Different ruling families compete over different pieces of territory. The states change, the territories they rule shift about, especially in the pre-Westphalian period. Sometimes we do refer to the ruling families of Europe or of Islamic states as dynasties. But in China and in ancient Egypt, and that's pretty much it, we use dynasty in a very different way. In Chinese historiography, a dynasty is not a family. It's a monarchy itself. It is the monarchy itself. And sometimes, but not always, it's a sizable, diverse empire. We don't say, for example, the Aisin-Jioro dynasty ruled the Qing Empire. We don't say the Li dynasty ruled the Tang or the Zhou dynasty ruled the Ming, though those are the family names of the imperial clans. Instead, we call the empire itself a dynasty and put it in a list of what are called Chinese dynasties. In fact, both meanings of dynasty, the first one being regime, power generally, and then the second one being a family lineage, both of them were there at the beginning when the term began to be first used in French in the early 18th century and then was quickly adopted into English. Du Halde's General History of China, which was published in English in 1736, 1 year after a French original, and this is a very influential, really kind of the first general history, survey history of China. This influential book and subsequent references to China were in fact the most common use of the word dynasty in the English language right after it came into English. The original usage to mean a power or a state though, has declined generally. In fact, that meaning is now considered archaic by the Oxford English Dictionary, while the sense of ruling family is predominant. It's the strongest modern connotation of the term. So how does this atavistic use of the word dynasty affect our sense of Chinese history? Consider this statement. Britain has been part of Italy since the Roman Empire. It's ridiculous. But how does it really differ from Xinjiang has been part of China since the Han Dynasty? How come we even partially accept this statement about Xinjiang and the Han Dynasty to hold water? It's not because the history of the East Asian continent is more unitary or continuous than Europe's. No, it's because of the way the construct of Chinese dynasties works. To call a selected list of monarchies and empires ruled by many different families with Sinic and non-Sinic backgrounds in different places at different times, sometimes in different places at the same time, to call them all Chinese dynasties gives a false impression of political continuity. Dynasties come and go, but China remains. Within the dynasty paradigm, China is a constant bottle being repeatedly refilled with wine. All under heaven is unified, it fragments, it unifies again, but there's always an immanent China there, even when there isn't, and even when there's no such word. We don't call, so I'm saying, don't call them dynasties. Instead, say things like the Han Empire had military contact, the Han Empire had military colonies in what is now the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So what? The Roman Empire had outposts in Britain at the same time, right? So you see how if we stop using dynasties in this kind of metaphysical way, it changes the way we talk about the Chinese past. Okay, I could talk a lot more about that, in particular how the dynasty list in the simplified form we usually give it and say it, it actually erases non-Han states and peoples, either by not including them at all, or by subsuming them in terms like Northern and Southern dynasties, or by giving them Chinese names, and so on. All right, so you've got the idea. I'm going to move on to specific terms that we should reconsider and modify and maybe even purge from our China history vocabulary. And I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here, which is running short. All right, so most of us are already familiar with the use of unify, your tongyi, where we might better use the word conquer. And there's an earlier version, actually, a similar euphemism in Qing Dynasty and older sources of pacify, various uses of various compounds using the character ding. And so generally, we're quite careful to not use those, or we should be. Likewise, the term peaceful liberation of Xinjiang is not something that most scholars outside of China would use. But there are related euphemisms that still are used all the time. And I've written these myself or said them. For example, that the Republic of China or the PRC inherited Xinjiang from the Qing, or that the PRC succeeded the Qing, or that the CCP reunified China. So we need to be careful not to blur these lines, I think, between Qing Empire and the PRC. And be careful not to project PRC propaganda backwards. All right, I'm skipping over a little bit of my text here. So watch out for unify and any verbs prefixed by re, right? Okay. The idea of rebellions in Qing Xinjiang, and this is not a euphemism of language exactly, but a question of historical accuracy and nuance. And there's some debate possible in this. So what I'm talking about here is the unrest in the Kashgar region in the early 19th century. And I don't call them rebellions. I talk instead about invasions by the Hoja party or Kokand, which sometimes enjoyed some but not universal local support. Sometimes too, you'll see Yaqub Beg's invasion and his establishment of an emirate as called a rebellion. This is a confusing time since there was a lot of real rebellion around with Tongan and Uyghur uprisings in the region since the 1860s. It's perhaps tempting to draw a line between 19th century episodes of resistance and 20th and 21st century resistance to the Republic and People's Republic. And I can see why that's a tempting thing to do. But that tends to give us the idea in media and simplified representations, that gives us the idea of China's restless province, and also the idea that Uyghurs have sought their freedom from China for centuries. So I don't draw that line, don't call these rebellions for a couple of interpretive reasons, as well as empirical reasons. First, I think that talking about one long Uyghur rebellion from the early 19th century to the present plays into the jihad narrative, the idea that Muslims must rebel against non-Muslim rule, but that's really not what has been going on. We're seeing less of that jihad narrative a little bit nowadays, but it used to be very, very common in talking about the region. Second, the centuries of rebellion narrative conflates Qing with China, which I said above is something we should start not doing. I don't think it's correct or strategic to do it. And third, this kind of ongoing rebellion narrative obscures an important fact, namely that before the 1830s and even a little bit later, Qing imperial rule in Xinjiang was pluralist. It tried to keep Han from settling permanently in Altashar. The Qing never attempted to assimilate non-Han people. It did permit permanent Han settlement in the South after 1831, and from 1879, it implemented more colonialist and assimilationist policies to whatever limited degree that it could. But I think it's useful to point out that the first century of Qing rule was culturally laissez-faire, and thus peaceful and economically thriving. Sinicization as a spontaneous process is a myth, and forced sinicization was not a successful policy of East Asian empires. All right, cognizant of my time, which is, I guess, almost out, right? I think, let's see, yeah, okay. I'm just gonna very quickly go over some of my other terms here. The idea of minorities, right? Empires don't really have minorities. Minorities are made when national movements decide that some people belong there while marginalizing others. And of course, we have this discourse of 55 Shaoshu Minzu in China. And we should recognize that that language is really an idiom of control. Now, I would argue, and again, I don't think many scholars are doing this, but we definitely see in the press this idea of China's Muslim minorities. And I don't think we should be using that term. What do we use instead is sort of a tricky question. Indigenous peoples is not universally accepted because to some people, the idea indigenous seems to imply that these are stateless peoples. I think there is a reason to bring up indigeneity of Central Asians because it opens up parallels to indigenous peoples and what they're suffering elsewhere. But of course, there are other terms that we can use besides minorities, Native people, Central Asians, non-Han peoples, marginalized peoples. Frontiers, borderlands, peripheries, Suzerain territory, those kinds of terms. And this is a mea culpa from me. In the 1990s, I wrote a chapter in which I called attention to the Qing frontiers, and I called for an inauguration of Qing frontier studies. And without elaborating on that, I realize now that that was really quite euphemistic language. I wouldn't say that everything that we refer to as a frontier or a borderland in the former Qing or in PRC should be called a colony. But many of those places really, and many of the processes that I was talking about as frontier studies are really colonialism, state-driven, market-driven, migration-driven. And so I'm really using colonialism much more, and I wanted to mention that kind of valence of the term frontier studies. I know I'm at the end of my time, I believe, but I wanted to mention just a couple more. Separatism. Now, as we all know, separatism is one of the three evils, along with extremism and terrorism. I'm saying this ironically parroting PRC propaganda here, of course. Now, commentators outside of the PRC generally agree that terrorism is bad and that extremism probably is too. And of course, thanks to Sean Roberts and other people's work, we've been somewhat successful lately in overcoming the global war on terror narrative that used to dominate the discussion of the region and so on. But English language writing on the Uyghur region, although we're skeptical of claims of extremism and terrorism, it still often seems to take for granted that unrest in Xinjiang is due to separatism. But when you think about it, what exactly is the evidence for that, or the evidence that any particular protest or even violent action is separatist? Now, of course, there are many Uyghurs abroad who yearn for an independent Eastern Turkestan. And given what's going on, nobody can blame them, or nobody can blame you, I should say, since I'm addressing many of you here. But when talking about unrest, even violent incidents in the Uyghur region up to 2017, we generally have no more evidence of the motivation behind any protest or action that it was separatist than we do that it was inspired by extremist Islam. And many of those, yeah, okay, thank you, Joe. Right, we don't really know what the cause for that is. All right, very quickly, two more things. The acronyms. We've demilitarized a couple of important acronyms in the process of translating and acronyming them. One of those is this term IJOP, right? The so-called Integrated Joint Operations Program or platform. If you actually look at it, it's the 一体化联合作战平台. It has this word 作战 in the name, war making. So let's call it the Integrated Military Operations Platform, putting military back in there. And then the amazing one on this is, of course, the XPCC, the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps. This term corps, as we know, is Bingtuan. It's the soldier corps. So let's bring the military back into that. All right, I'm all out of time. I'll simply conclude that this attention to normalized concepts and terminology is, of course, stimulated by current events, but I think it's really overdue in our discussion of Chinese history for empirical reasons, for the sake of good history writing, social analysis, and not just for political and humanitarian reasons. But those political and humanitarian reasons are critical too. In a war of information with millions of lives at stake, the words and concepts really matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Millward. So I'd like to call our first group of panelists up to the speaker table, please. So Vanessa, Imogen, Ursula, and Megha, and Professor Heather Shaw is already here. Thank you.
I learned a lot from Jim's speech. I'm not a specialist on the region of what we might call Eastern Turkestan in Central Asian Studies, but it's pretty fascinating to be here. And the topic we're going to take in this first panel is that around evidence gathering and method. I hope I'm coming over clearly online. I guess the tech people will tell me if there's an audio problem there. I've met a couple of our panelists. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting the other two, but I thank them all for joining us. What we're particularly fortunate, I think, here with this panel is that we have a mixed group of disciplines and professions, and that's true of the conference as a whole. So we have an academic, two excellent journalists, and a human rights and legal practitioner. And of course, we have faced many similar challenges and some slightly different ones based on our professional perspective. But the core theme, of course, is how do we know what we know, and why don't we know what we don't know? And they're really important questions. So we've got an hour. I'm going to keep that hour because we've got 4 people, so we're going to be late, but I'll try and keep us to that hour. So that's 10 minutes per person. And we're going to start with Vanessa FRANGVILLE from the University Libre de Bruxelles. And she's the chairholder in Chinese Studies and co-director of the Routledge Contemporary East Asian Societies series. So over to Vanessa.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? How about now? Hello? Yeah. Okay. all that. That's how that works. Okay, thank you very much, and kudos to the organizers actually for putting together such a stimulating event, and thank you for being so responsive. It's very difficult. Context of the pandemic, it's great that we can have this event all together. So time is very limited, so I'm not going to show any PowerPoints. You have to listen to me. And I will share a few reflections, and I hope that we have more time during the Q&A to discuss what you think may be of interest to you in what I'm going to say. So I would like to share a few. Okay, in committing, no, what's going on in the Uyghur? No. Sorry. Is that any better? Yes? Okay, cool. Okay, so since 2018, our knowledge of the camps has increased considerably based on the collection and the analysis of, for instance, satellite images, public recruitment documents, public tenders, and so on and so forth. So thanks to the work of Adrian Zenz and others, we were able to locate camps, to make estimates about their capacity, to understand their physical organizations, the facilities that they include, how they operate outside the legal system, and so on and so forth. But in the past 2 years, I think that public testimonies about the camps by survivors, as they are often called, have really taken an essential part in the construction of our knowledge about the camps. For instance, this year in June, the Uyghur Tribunal opened with a series of hearings in which direct witnesses in camps really played a major role. And for instance, at the Belgian Parliament or in the US and probably in the UK as well, testimonies of these direct witnesses really made a difference. So they are now also available in various forms. So you have testimonies through books, even through mangas, interviews in the press. You have public statements, of course, hearings, and so on and so forth. So what I want to say is that testimonies really have a prominent epistemic role here, and I think that deserves our attention. So first, testimonies really played a pivotal role in our knowledge about the violence experienced within the camps. Of course, there are control towers, there are barbed wire fences, there's this massive illegal arrest campaign, and there are all sorts of expressions of violence. But first-hand and first-person narratives and accounts of direct experiences of violence, I think, remain the most powerful tools that we have at our disposal for assessing the extent of the crisis at both individual and collective levels. So through these testimonies, I think we all read testimonies or heard testimonies here, we understand that violence is exerted in various forms. So it can be everyday acts of humiliation, shaming, it can be physical harm, absence of food, isolation, rape, and so on and so forth. We also understand that there are obviously different kinds of camps with various levels of violence. And there still are many gaps, of course, in our knowledge of how systematic, how organized such abuses are. We also lack of information about the perpetrators. Some witnesses mention Han perpetrators. Some witnesses mention Kazakh or Uyghur perpetrators or perpetrators from other groups. So there are, of course, still some lacks in our knowledge, but still, By crossing various testimonies, we grab a good sense of the culture of violence that dominates in the camps. And without these testimonies, we would not have learned about torture, sexual abuses, mistreatments of all kinds, because these are hidden behind the walls of the camps. We don't have access. So knowledge of violence comes first and foremost from testimonies, just like information about the life in Nazi camps didn't come from German documents. It came from oral and written testimonies from those who lived there or experienced violence there. The second point is that testimonies are really crucial in shaping a collective narrative of the ongoing crisis. So there are first-hand testimonies which are really instrumental in spreading the news about the critical situation of many Uyghurs worldwide, but they also help to strengthen the reception and the acknowledgement of the terror undergone. Sometimes these testimonies also change the paradigm of our research. You know, we refocus, for instance, on sterilization, mass sterilization, the idea of mass destruction, as we learned about torture, about rape, and so on and so forth. It actually changed the focus of the debates. For instance, we are talking about genocide today, and this is not something that was raised before these testimonies were really out. So I think this was really crucial. And of course, these testimonies benefit the witnesses at an individual level because they gain from being listened. Because they bear witness to trauma, so that helps them to reintegrate into a community and to rebuild their identity. But what is even more important is that they are not just individual victims, they are members of a larger community. And so these testimonies are not just individual acts. It's actually a community affair. And the Uyghur community is now shaping its narrative, based on these testimonies. And in that sense, it's really important to understand the general economy in which these testimonies take place. You don't just have to talk, you have to be listened and heard. So that's something that I wish we could examine more closely, the conditions in which these narratives are produced and received. So again, witnesses, by providing testimonies, they give us an important insight into the events. But of course, these testimonies also have a social and political role, right? So again, at an individual level, testimonies, for instance, help witnesses to find political refugee, for instance, in Europe or in the US. At a collective level, testimonies helped Uyghur activists, for instance, to shape narrative about the ongoing genocide. It helped to mobilize the Uyghur community, but also HR organization, political institutions, journalists, and so on and so forth, and scholars, of course. So these platforms through which testimonies are now heard are also very important to look at. So just sharing this reflection. And I will wrap up. So testimonies, I think, generate a collective narrative and a collective memory of the events, so they are very important to look at. I just want to raise three little things, very shortly. First, testimonies feed in collective narrative, but maybe the collective narrative is going to feed in future testimonies as well, so we have to look at how that works. And like any memory, it will tend to be selective. So we need to look at what these testimonies highlight and what they don't say, actually. So that's an important point. The second point is that what do we do with testimonies that are not public? I'm only talking about public testimonies. But there's a growing number of public testimonies, of course, from direct witnesses out there. But out of millions of people who may have been detained, it's only a handful, to be honest. So there are many non-public testimonies. So non-public because they are not made available, they are anonymous, and so on and so forth. What kind of knowledge could we gain from these testimonies is a question we really need to ask. And lastly, most public witnesses recounted their experiences in 2017 and 2018. But in fact, we don't have testimonies from inside the camps since the late 2018, early 2019. It's been 2 years, more than 2 years now. So what is really happening now in the camps remains unknown. That's a big question mark, and I think that's also something quite worrying. So I will stop here. Thanks for listening, and I hope I kept with time. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and superbly timed as well. So our second speaker is Imogen ROGERSON COSTELLO, who is with the Rights Practice. She's a senior project officer there, supporting those working for human rights in China, and she's going to speak a little bit about judicial transparency in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
Hi. I'm also not going to show a PowerPoint, just to try and be quick. Hi, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk today. I want to talk a bit about our experience trying to find official data on criminal proceedings in Xinjiang. Is this okay? It's like, oh, maybe I should take this. Yeah, okay. Oh, sorry. Sorry, that's not a good start to this one? Yeah. This one? Okay, sorry. It's okay. Okay, I'm going to try again. Okay. So we're going to. I'm going to talk about our experience trying to find official data on criminal proceedings in Xinjiang. There have actually been official calls for more openness in judicial decision making, but secrecy continues to surround the use of criminal proceedings in China. And this lack of transparency is especially true in the Uyghur region, in a very politically sensitive context. And it's also worsening. And this hugely impacts researchers, lawyers, and the families of those detained. Thank you. So I hope today I can just give you some insights which will help us all to demand more information from Chinese officials. As John mentioned, I work for the Rights Practice, and we're a small NGO focused on human rights in China. And earlier this year, we spent some time researching, and we published a working paper focused on criminal law and the deprivation of liberty in Xinjiang. And we wanted to look at the criminal law because this is a poorly understood area in the treatment of Uyghurs. And in 2018, there were reports of a big increase in criminal prosecutions in Xinjiang in recent years, and this really concerned us. And we wanted to see if we could find longer-term trends in the use of the criminal law. And the Chinese criminal justice system should, in principle, give better legal protections than forms of extrajudicial detention, such as the internment camps. But the Chinese Communist Party informs all aspects of governance in China, including the legal system. And since in 2014, the Chinese government launched a politicized strike hard counterterrorism campaign in Xinjiang. And this type of strike hard campaign increases the risk of miscarriages of justice, torture, and execution. And from what we found, there is evidence of an increase in arrests, prosecutions, and heavy sentences in Xinjiang. But there's also a massive absence of data about the use of prison and the way in which the criminal law is being applied. And this lack of data raises lots more questions and just reinforces suspicions that China has something to hide. So I'd just like to give you a brief overview of some of the main sources that we looked at and how they're each incomplete and the impact of this. So the three main sources we looked at were official statistics, databases, and information released by relatives. So firstly, limiting judicial statistics is an ongoing practice in China. There's no law that requires the Supreme People's Court, and that's the highest level court, to distribute judicial statistics. But there are regulations that do give the principle of openness. So for our research, we looked at crime statistics, their arrests, prosecutions, court cases, and convictions from 2011 to 2020. And the Supreme People's Procuratorate, which is the prosecution, and also the Supreme People's Court, release national work reports each year. And these usually include headline crime statistics that are taken from lower-level provincial work reports. So the provincial procuratorates release statistics on the number of arrests and prosecutions in their work reports. And we found that the statistics published by the Xinjiang People's Procuratorate do show this massive increase in arrests in Xinjiang in 2017. But since then, there appears to have been a decrease in annual arrest rates. However, it's really difficult to compare year-on-year changes as the format of these reports is not consistent each year. So, for example, the Xinjiang People's Procuratorate Annual Work Report for 2017 only shows a 5-year total on arrests for 2013 to 2017. So we actually had to estimate the annual total for 2017 by deducting from totals for other years. And in terms of prosecutions, we found similar trends. There's this big increase in 2017, and there appears to be a decrease in more recent years. And then we also compared this to other comparator provinces in China, and no other province reported such a widely disproportionate number of arrests in 2017 compared to the size of its population. So what's happened to these tens of thousands of people arrested and prosecuted? This really requires an official explanation. So the courts also publish annual work reports, which include statistics on the numbers of cases accepted by the court and the number of cases concluded. And the Xinjiang Higher Court has released numbers of criminal cases it accepted each year for 2011 to 2015. And over this period, the number of cases increased by over double. However, the court didn't publish any statistics for the number of criminal cases it accepted in 2016. So we also had to look at the China Law Yearbook, and this is a yearbook published by the China Law Society. And the China Law Yearbook did report on the criminal cases that were accepted in 2017, and it was 3.5 times the total for 2015. However, since 2018, the China Law Yearbook has not reported the total numbers of criminal cases accepted and concluded, or the numbers of people convicted. And information on prison sentences is also really hard to find. So we found that the numbers published by the China Law Yearbook showed a doubling of sentences for serious crimes in Xinjiang in 2015. We also found evidence of these heavy sentences in cases and interviews we carried out. But since 2016, the China Law Yearbook has not released statistics on the number of people given prison terms of 5 years or more. And the political sensitivity of the data and this 2015 increase may explain why the data is no longer available. There's also certain information such as death penalty statistics that cannot be released under any circumstance. And death penalty statistics are classified as top secret in state secrets law, and this is the highest possible level of secrecy. So we actually have no way of knowing the total number of people sentenced to death in Xinjiang. And we ourselves haven't yet found any evidence of sentences of death penalty with immediate execution in the region since 2014. But this doesn't mean that executions have not been approved. It just reflects the secrecy surrounding the numbers of executions carried out. So as well as statistics, we also wanted to dig deeper about cases and procedure. And we looked at the official database, China Judgments Online. And this is an online database of decisions from all levels of Chinese courts. And it was set up in 2013 by the Supreme People's Court. And it was a response to calls for greater openness and was seen at that time as a step forward for transparency by Chinese lawyers and legal scholars. However, in reality, the cases are uploaded selectively, and there are a large number of cases missing, including Xinjiang cases. So even since we started this research, there are far fewer cases. Since June this year, millions more cases have been taken off the website, including all judgments for endangering state security. And we originally looked at 6 criminal cases as part of our research, and now only 2 of them are left. Also, to access the database, you need to register using a SIM number, and then once you've logged in, it works really slowly, and there are limited search functions. So, for example, the cases are not tagged by gender or ethnicity of defendants, even though the documents should show this. So it's really hard to see how many Uyghur cases there are in total, and it also means it's difficult to analyze intersecting forms of discrimination. The judgments that are on there do give basic information on the defendant and about the proceedings, but the written judgments vary in length and quality. And in the 6 cases involving Uyghurs that we analysed, we did find other areas of concern, but this obviously isn't enough to give really in-depth analysis about trends and can only give us a small snapshot. So, for example, we have limited information on the role of the lawyer in Xinjiang cases. And in Chinese law, defendants are entitled to a lawyer, but in practice, many individuals across China, not just in Xinjiang, do not have access to a lawyer or legal aid. And the China Law Yearbook reports that over 70% of cases in Xinjiang in 2016 were not represented by a lawyer. And in 2017, this actually increased to over 90%. And in 2 cases that we looked at on China judgments online, the defense did make allegations of torture and arguments for mitigation, but both these cases were of Uyghurs actually outside of Xinjiang. In cases across China, lawyers can be another source of information when the database is lacking, but we don't have this in Xinjiang. And then lastly, as part of our research, we spoke also with 8 Uyghurs currently overseas and with relatives believed to be in prison in China. In total, the interviews we carried out provided information on 18 individuals, and we specifically wanted to learn what official information and documents the families had received. And under international law, close relatives would expect to have information on the crimes their family members had been convicted for, whether they have access to a lawyer, and sentences. In Chinese law, there's no obligation to provide details on the criminal process to relatives of a suspect or detainee, but under the criminal law, there are documents that should be provided. So for example, prisons should provide the prisoner's family with written notification within 5 days from the date a person arrives at the prison. However, none of the family members we spoke to had received official documents directly from the procuratorate or the prisons. However, one had received an incarceration notice, but they obtained this through a friend. Others had received a letter or a phone call from the Chinese embassy in the country where they lived, which confirmed the person was serving a prison sentence. But many had received absolutely no official notification of any kind that their relative was in prison. And in 10 of the cases we looked at, family members had received some information about the sentence. And sentences varied from 7 to 20 years, with the average being 14 years, 11 months. Few families had details about the specific crimes their relatives had been convicted for, and that's really concerning. In a climate of fear and repercussions, individuals may also be too scared to challenge and demand for information about their relatives. So I'll just really briefly outline some of what we found in terms of official statistics, databases, and information released by relatives, as well as the impact of this. As you can see, it's a really big challenge trying to research on criminal proceedings in Xinjiang. But there are serious concerns over this huge increase in arrests and prosecutions and heavy sentencing. And as the information is complete, this leaves lots of questions unanswered. And this lack of transparency obviously undermines our own knowledge as international researchers, but also the opportunity for informed debate in China. And it just reinforces suspicions that the authorities have something to hide.
Thanks, Imogen. So our next speaker is Megha RAJAGOPALAN, who is with BuzzFeed News. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent who was in China from 2012 to 2018, and she's going to give us a journalist's perspective on reporting in Xinjiang.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the issues around physical access in the region for journalists, as well as touch on some of the topics that Vanessa and Imogen have already alluded to around some of the issues and some of the kind of benefits and problems around interviewing former detainees and prisoners, and then talk a little bit about some of the work that my team has done to try to piece together different types of evidence in order to get a more complete picture of what life is like inside camps and prisons in Xinjiang. So I think probably most people here will be quite familiar with, why is it that journalists don't just go to Xinjiang and talk to people and report there? But I just wanted to sort of unpack this a little bit further because I think that Ursula is going to talk about this a little bit too, but I think the situation there in terms of access for journalists has changed significantly even over the past few years. I left China in 2018, which wasn't that long ago. The last time that I was in Xinjiang, I was like hassled a little bit by the police, but eventually I went by taxi and on foot to try to find one of the camps, which I knew the location of before I arrived there. I think today that would probably not be possible. A big part of that is because of the kind of growing international outrage and press coverage that has surrounded this issue. my friends who are currently reporters in China have said that this has been exacerbated even a degree further because of the pandemic. And this is not just in Xinjiang, but it's in, lots of different parts of China, including places that you wouldn't necessarily consider to be that sensitive. One example is a reporter named Sophia Yan, who is working on a story about an ethnic minority group that traditionally herds reindeer. And even she was sort of hassled in the course of doing that and given the excuse that this is like a pandemic-related issue. So I think that this is sort of like another layer of kind of like curbs on movement for journalists in the region. The two other things that I think that are the most important are issues around surveillance of and harassment of sources, as well as pressure on visas. So the surveillance aspect is discussed a lot. I think the primary way in which it inhibits journalists is that it creates this kind of ethical quandary. Like if you're talking to anyone in the region, you have to then wonder what sort of repercussions they're going to face, and that includes both in-person and digital communications. In terms of visas, it creates pressure on the companies that we work for. Obviously, many journalists that were previously based in China have recently lost their visas. I think that like sort of underneath that process is also pressure on visas for visiting journalists, of which there are a lot actually that want to go to Xinjiang and try to film and cover things, and also pressure on like not just the journalists that have actually gone and done the reporting, but on like future colleagues that may come in like afterwards. I think that's something that has certainly gotten worse, even since I left China. So given all that, it's sort of no surprise that a lot of journalists who, including myself, who've reported on this issue, have relied a lot on the accounts of former detainees and also family members of those recently in the region. So obviously former detainees take on extraordinary risks to be able to speak publicly, not just to journalists, but also in all kinds of other forums that Vanessa talked about, and we're very grateful to them. Having said that, there are, I think there are some problems with the testimonies of former detainees that I want to sort of unpack, because I think it sort of sheds light into like this question of like, how do we know what we know and what don't we know about this subject? So I think so I just want to sort of caveat this by saying this is really just based on my personal work experience and not necessarily representative of all of the journalists that work on this through ex-detainee interviews. But these are just sort of my observations and things I've noticed in the course of work. I think one issue is that almost all of the press coverage relies on all of it relies on a pretty non-representative sample of former detainees and prisoners. And by that, I mean that the people that we're getting, the people that are willing to talk to us are disproportionately of Kazakh ethnicity. They're disproportionately either middle class or wealthy. The last thing is, as Vanessa pointed out, they almost like all of them, like, I think the overwhelming majority left prior to 2018. So we're now like a couple of years out of date. So like, why is this the case? So on the first point, it's my understanding that the Kazakh government, as well as like people in Kazakhstan, like individual citizens who might be relatives, like people like spouses and parents and stuff like that, were quite successful in advocating for the kind of early release of people with strong ties to Kazakhstan. So these are people that were like dual nationals or green card holders, or like maybe had a spouse or something in the country. So as a result of that, and as well as the kind of resettlement policy that the Kazakh government has, to basically allow its diaspora elsewhere and in any other part of the world to come and resettle back in Kazakhstan, it created a situation where there was this kind of pretty sizable population of former detainees that were not only able to resettle in Kazakhstan, but they were able to do it legally and with kind of not really a strong fear of like persecution in that country for speaking to the media. So that created a condition where a lot of Kazakh former detainees were able to come forward. You can go on YouTube and see a lot of their testimonies in Kazakh language as well as in the media. But it does mean that we're getting a lot of information from people that come from a certain part of the region and come from a certain ethnic background that is not representative of necessarily all of the people in the region. Another thing that I've noticed is that almost all of the former detainees that we speak with are so we know, of course, that in camps at least there are sort of classifications. This has been documented by a number of people in terms of the severity of the crime that they're supposed to have committed. So people describe this in different ways. In interviews, some people talk about colors of uniforms. Some people talk about what floor they stay on in the camp. But it seems like a lot of former detainees have talked about there being kind of like 3 divisions. There were some prisons that are, or camps that have been prisons or camps that have that are said to be just for people that have committed really serious crimes, or maybe things that aren't crimes but transgressions. And there are some that house sort of all 3 categories of people. Like I've interviewed probably myself something around like 2 dozen or maybe a little bit more former detainees, and I have tried to ask people sort of like, what category are you in? And almost exclusively people will say they were in the lowest category. I think I've met one person or maybe a couple who were in the middle category. But generally speaking, you don't get people that were told that they committed a very serious offense, whether criminal or not. And I think I would suspect that the reason for that is that if you had committed such an offense, it would be very hard for you to then leave the country. So that's another kind of way that this population is self-selecting. Yeah, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about is, is this issue of corroborating what people say. So as Imogen has just noted, like one of the problems with this is that people just don't have documentation. I reported in China for a while, and a lot of the human rights and other cases around criminal justice that we would look at in other parts of China, you would at least get, like, you would be able to talk to the person's lawyer, you would be able to get something like an arrest report, and that was sort of like the burden of evidence that we would have as journalists to write about a particular criminal case. In Xinjiang, of course, this is not possible. You talk to relatives even inside the country in other parts of China. You can talk to lawyers that work with people in the region. None of these people are able to furnish any kind of documentation. When you go and talk to former detainees outside the country, including Uyghur detainees, Kazakh detainees, like really anyone, it's very, very rare that they will have documentation. Some people do. But one of the reasons that people give for this is that they don't want to take this stuff either digitally or physically when they leave the country because they're afraid of being searched at the airport. I will wrap up really quickly because I have just a minute left. I want to just add that I worked on a project last year with Alison Killing, who's an architect and researcher. And I think one of the things we learned out of that project is that, it helps to try to corroborate these kinds of data in different ways. We took a whole bunch of satellite images and tried to use testimony of ex-detainees as well as other documentation to help corroborate what we were seeing in the images. And this kind of process of going back and forth between these sources who very kindly helped us by filling in what they remembered of their time in camps and prisons, as well as the images we saw in historical and current satellite images, yielded a kind of more fruitful or like more complete picture than we would have gotten with any individual one of those sources. So let me just end there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Megha. So our final speaker is a second journalist who has also had experience of being forcibly required to leave China. That's Ursula GAUTHIER, who's the former China correspondent for the French news organization L'Obs. Ursula.
Thank you for inviting me. Is it okay? Do you hear me? Okay. So I must say, when I left China in 31st December of 1915, because I was expelled for my writings about Xinjiang, I was afraid that my colleagues, the ones who remained there, I was afraid that they would be a little bit intimidated, because losing your visa means you have to leave the country. You have to, maybe if you're not a staff in your own media, you have to find another media. You have to resettle in your country. It might be very difficult. And I was really happy, relieved, and proud of my colleagues who were still there, that they continued this work. And they even did more than that. They went to Xinjiang and they really found, the places, the people, etc. So I want to talk about what it is to be a foreign correspondent there, and trying to cover this major issue of not only of China news, but the world news. First of all, you have to know that it is very difficult for foreign journalists to work in China, whatever the issue, whatever. I have worked on land grabs, and it's very complicated to go there, to speak to people, and to get the information. I have worked about Tibetans, and it is also really difficult. In the case of Tibetans, China has found a way to not let the foreign journalists go. There is a special regulation which makes going to Tibet Autonomous Region, Lhasa capital, impossible if you don't have a local visa. It's only for foreign journalists, not other people. So the tourists would get easily the visa, but not the foreign journalists. So they try to limit the coverage of Tibet in this way. Fortunately for Tibet, there are other, 4 other provinces, Chinese provinces, who have part or in total Tibetan areas, and that areas are accessible to foreign journalists. In the case of Xinjiang, there is no limitation of that kind. In principle, any journalist, any person can go there as long as they have a visa for China. But in fact, I'm talking about even before the concentration camps. In fact, it was really very difficult for journalists to go there. I'm not talking about Chinese journalists, because they know this is a very sensitive question, and usually they don't touch upon those problems. And we can understand them, because otherwise they lose everything. So it was only the foreign journalists who could, care about those issues. So we tried, as I'm talking about the community of foreign correspondents, we always spoke about that. And one day, with a colleague, a French colleague, we decided to go there. It was a horribly complicated thing to put in operation. You have to leave your telephone in Beijing. You cannot take your laptop, obviously. You have to have a way to have the contacts, telephone numbers, but in a way that if you are caught, they won't be able to read it. So you create codes, etc., to write down the numbers and the names of the people that you can contact. You don't contact them beforehand. You go there, you buy a local telephone, and you contact there with the local telephone. You don't fly to Urumqi. If you fly to Urumqi, you are before you leave Beijing, you are already followed. And if you go to Urumqi, they will follow you immediately, 24/7. So in our case, we decided to have a car, and to take it in a different province, and to drive. This means driving 2,000 kilometers before arriving to the interest point. And it means that you don't go to hotels, any hotel, even the smallest hotel in the smallest place. As soon as you register in the hotel, they are directly linked to the police station. And if it's a foreigner, especially with a foreign press visa, immediately the police will come and ask you and take you for the night, etc. And then probably send you back. So it was really very complicated. We had to use our driving licenses, old driving licenses on which, the nationality was not written. And we had to pretend that we were from some, very weird minority. And then every time that was possible, we would go to people's places, unknown people, not people that we knew, people that we had encountered in the small restaurant in a small place. And then we said, there's no hotel here, so we need to sleep. Can you take us in your home? And so this is the way that you escape the police surveillance. And even with all those precautions, we were caught twice, etc. So what I'm saying is that it's difficult to cover China, but Xinjiang was, 10 times more difficult. And we went with a very precise aim. We wanted to document one important incident that had happened in a place called Lukchun. And it was a thing that rarely before 2017, rarely before the concentration camps, did the Chinese government talk about the incidents. They just didn't want to say that there was an incident. Everything was okay, just small problems here and there. But this one made the news, the national news, and even more. There was a person from the permanent committee of the Politburo who went there after the event, and it meant that it was really important. Officially, 37 dead. So we decided to go to Lukchun 6 months later to see what happened there, in fact. And well, it was difficult to enter Lukchun. There were some, everywhere. Checkpoints, etc. You have to use very, very numerous bizarre ways. You have to wait for the lunchtime. During lunchtime, the policemen go to have their lunch, so you can sneak in with your own car. You don't have a driver. You don't have an interpreter. You don't have any fixer. It's too dangerous for them. So you go by yourself, and you sneak in, and then you try to find someone to talk to. But you know that if you talk to someone, as you said, this person can be arrested, questioned, who knows what. So we finally managed to talk to 2 persons who told us that there were not only 37 persons dead, but a whole bunch more. They didn't know if it was hundreds or thousands, because at the end, this incident, which began with a brawl in a police station about women who had their Islamic veil, and the policemen wanted them to take it off. And the women resisted, or we don't know precisely. Anyway, the husbands came, and there was a fight between the Uyghurs and the policemen, and then there were probably victims. And so China, the government, sent in the helicopters, and they bombarded the whole place. And there were hundreds and thousands of people killed. So we had 2 testimonies, one from a local vineyard worker who told us he could speak some Chinese, so he could explain something. And then finally from a fruit vendor and so the fruit vendor, he was a Hui, which is Muslim but not Uyghur, and he is from the next village from this one, Lukchun, and he could tell us exactly what happened, what in his community was said about this event. So what I want to say is that even before the concentration camps, harrowing events were going on, any protest could become a massacre. Any street brawl, everything. The young men were taken, and the number of disappearing young men was staggering. But no one talked about that. We don't have numbers. We don't have any justice documents, nothing. So these are only testimonies, but testimonies given by people who are terribly afraid of talking and who just happen by, it has to be not on purpose. You cannot go and find a person that you know and ask her what happened. You have to speak to people you don't know, who don't know you, who don't know that you're a foreign journalist, and who would, just as a conversation, would tell things. So this was the degree, the level of difficulties at that time. And I will finish by saying that today, it is just, even what we did, in 2014, 15, it's impossible today, because there's not only the harassment, the police following 24/7, there's also the cameras and the surveillance, and people know that what they say, who they meet, will be immediately known. So this kind of underground report has become impossible. So this is a huge issue, because, as you said, we have the people who came out from the camps, but we don't know really how the population is living. And there is no way to know that if there are no reporters to go there and talk, and you're right about that. So it's a huge black hole in China and in the world, in fact, and we are accepting that. And what I can say is that today's foreign journalists, they are more and more, it's not that they don't want to go, it's that it is so complicated. You go there and maybe you will be there for 7 days and you will never meet someone who will say something. You will just see ordinary scenery in the streets, and your media has paid for this trip, which is quite expensive, with nothing which came out. So only very, very rich media can afford that. The others will have problems to send their reporters with so little chance to bring something. So the situation is dire.
Okay, thank you to all the speakers who did a fantastic job of conveying so much in such a short period of time. We do have time now for questions, and we're going to take them from the audience here. I assume it's also possible for people in the chat to ask questions, and I'll give voice to those. So please do raise your hand in the room, and if you're joining us on Teams, you feel free to write a question in the chat. Yes, a question there at the back. Obviously, introduce yourself when you ask your question. Do we have a roving microphone? Yeah, so that's going to come to you in a moment. Yeah, shout up here and I'll repeat it. We're going to try another microphone here. Oh.
Okay, so thank you very much, all of you, for very fascinating and informative, super important talk. My name is Megha. I'm from Newcastle University, and I have just I'm involved with this book, and I think the point
So I'll just repeat that question for the purpose of those watching online. So that's from Runa Steenberg, and the question was to Megha about the biases or the differences between those who speak publicly and those who do not. So Megha.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. It's difficult to answer without sort of dipping into generalizations, but with that caveat, I would say like, yeah, I mean, I think like this is just my observation as a person who's done these kinds of interviews is that people, not just former detainees, but really anyone who is in the position of just telling the same story over and over and over again, like you start to see some kind of like mechanization that happens to that. Like the story starts to change, right? It's like telling like a story at a dinner party over and over again. And you see that with a lot of detainees who have told their stories publicly like multiple times. So I think that's one thing. Another thing is that people who speak publicly, again, not just former detainees in Xinjiang, but anyone who's speaking publicly about sort of any like sort of harmful or traumatic experience, or really anything, they may have some motivation for doing that isn't just about sharing their story. They also may not. They may genuinely feel in their heart that if they don't attach their name and their credibility to this, that nobody will believe it. And I think that describes actually a lot of the people that I've interviewed. There are, of course, some people that are actively seeking, perhaps a visa to a different country, maybe seeking things like I've encountered one person who talked about wanting to do television appearances and something like that, stuff like that. If you are a person that is like an asylum seeker, or if you're in kind of a sensitive position in a foreign country, it's quite natural that you might think that, like you might sort of seek ways to earn money or to improve your financial situation. I don't think this necessarily means that somebody is being dishonest, but it does mean that as interviewers, we have to be aware of like motivations that someone might have other than, the obvious. This is, of course, not to say that people who speak publicly can all be described, or even most of them can be described like this. I think this is really a very, very small minority of people that I've interviewed. And then the last thing I want to say about people who speak publicly is that this is another thing that sort of biases this whole question of like, what do we know? The people who are speaking publicly are almost exclusively people who have like a visa or some kind of like very stable permanent status in whatever country they reside in. And the reason for that is that people who are not in that position are not willing to kind of like risk the blowback that they could possibly get either from representatives of the Chinese government or even their host government abroad. We all know very, very well how, how people who speak about this issue overseas, who are of Chinese descent or ethnic minority descent, get harassed, how their families face repercussions for speaking in that way. So the people that do have the courage and the ability and the wherewithal to speak publicly are obviously in the kind of strongest positions where they have the sort of least to fear. Again, these are all kind of generalizations, but just what I've observed.
Thank you. Time for more questions. Virtual audience questions on YouTube, I'm being told.
Hi, sorry, this is a question from someone on the YouTube. They just want someone to explain the repercussions for people who are speaking out.
Okay, repercussions for those who are speaking out. Who would like to take that one? Any examples that, I'm sure there are many people here who have seen examples of repercussions for those who have spoken out. Would anyone like to speak to that question? Vanessa?
If they have relatives who remained in China or in Xinjiang, then of course there will be repercussions on their families. So they might not be able to contact these relatives anymore, or these relatives may be checked by the police regularly, or simply forced to call them and ask them to be quiet. That's one of the repercussions. Being harassed on their phones is something that many have testified about. So the Chinese police would be able to find their phone number overseas and call them or send them texts. Sometimes their own relatives would send messages also to say, you have to be quiet, don't tell lies. You would even have public videos of relatives saying that this is outrageous because their situation is really not like what they say. And so that kind of repercussions are very common. I think most of the public witnesses have been fearing that their relatives would encounter that kind of issues. They don't fear for themselves as much as they fear for their relatives back home. And this is one of the most efficient threats, actually, that the Chinese government has been able to put out there. So, yeah, that kind of repression.
Thank you. I think time is soon up, but there's maybe time for one more question. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, so we've got one there in the audience. Please be as brief as possible.
So much. My question is to the two journalists. There seems to be obviously a vacuum of journalistic investigations in the region now. I'm just wondering if you can shed some light on whether the Chinese government, the CCP, is filling that vacuum and how effective they're doing it, and whether in many of these regimes that have been put to engage the services of Western lobby firms, PR firms, tech.
There's a huge campaign going on behalf of the Chinese government to fill that vacuum, or anyway to change the narrative. We see some so-called journalists who are not journalists, but who pretend they are, and who publish articles on the web. So they are not in media, but they are present on the web, on social media, and they pretend to have been there, to have experienced, you know, the normal life, the safety, etc., etc. So they are doing, obviously, propaganda for the Chinese government, and they are paid for that. Their travel expenses and everything is free. They don't pay to go there, and the rest we don't know. But they are, in fact, doing China's work, China's bid. So we have many of those in every country. I mean, in France, we know them. There are 4 or 5 of those guys who pretend to be, etc. You have also young people who are influencers on the internet and who live in China and who are, you know, hired by China to go to Xinjiang and to pretend to do tourist travel and to show magnificent images of what's going on there. So, and they just say that nothing of what is told in the normal media is true. They say it's all made up, it's all lies. But those young people, they have, you know, tens of thousands of followers. So it has some kind of influence. You have also intellectuals, or so-called intellectuals who come out and who speak for China in every country, I think. So there is a campaign orchestrated by the Chinese government to try to change the narrative. Fortunately, I would say, I can tell about France, it's not working. And now, compared to even 2 years ago, the awareness of what is happening in Xinjiang is much more than even 2 years ago. And you have, especially in France, a very interesting phenomenon of very young people who are active on social media, a great number of them who are very active in advocacy for the Uyghur cause. And we have a huge movement of young people. It's like 600,000 people. It's not a small thing, who are very active on social media, and also they go to their city hall, city mayor, and they ask from the city mayor not to accept the Chinese interferences in local life, not to accept the Confucius Institute, for example. So this can work in some places. I think in some countries it works, but at least for France and other European countries, it's not working.
Okay, thank you very much, Ursula. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Thank you particularly to Vanessa, Imogen, Megha, and Ursula for their contributions. And I think we made it through some teething problems with the technology. Hopefully that'll be better for subsequent panels, and we can all warm up now if we're in the room and get a coffee. Okay, thank you.